Let's get started.
Sorry, I just want to cough.
Oh, why do you always have to do that every single week?
Just I don't want to,
It's
just
so.
coughing. It's just, I'm like Biggie. I'm like, I'm just kind of, what's that called? Vocalizing.
Yeah, you need to be the kind of hype man in the background. It's like, welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga. And it's like, yeah, Bunga, or something like that.
I can be like Bez. The intellectual equivalent of Bez.
You're the dancer of
with the maracas, just getting people, getting people ready, getting people fired up. All right, sorry.
Good stuff.
Shut up.
All right.
Sort of apocalyptic predictions that your organisation makes?
They're very conservative numbers, that's what we'd say. And actually, a lot of the data in the IPCC report, not criticising scientists because they did an incredible job, they're using pre-industrial levels of data. They're looking at, carbon emissions. They're not factoring feedback loops, things like this. There are climate scientists saying now that we think it's a lot worse. James Hansen, ex-NASA scientist, is saying we're in a planetary emergency. So we're using that language. We're not trying to use alarmist language. We're listening to what scientists are saying and using language that we feel is appropriate to the situation.
You are losing alarmist language. One of your other founders said that she thought everybody could be dead within several decades. 97%.
So aren't we in agreement that we
it's the 2025 target, which is the keystone of your policy.
It's a precautionary principle.
Just ask you this. Most homes in this country are heated by gas. Most people cook with gas. The fact is, all of that would have to go in 6 years for a 2025 target, wouldn't it? All of it.
We put a man on the moon before we had the internet and mobile phones. We made an international space station. 16 countries worked together to make this and send the parts into space independently using math and assemble it in space. If we really wanted to tackle this emergency, Dr. James Hansen, an ex-NASA scientist, calling it a planetary emergency, Lord Stern...
So no cooking with gas or heating with gas.
But we've had 30 years to think of better solutions, and now is the time to act to bring down those emissions.
Hello, welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga. Environmental protest seems to be back in a big way, and I'll have to be honest, I'm a little bit surprised that we are doing an episode on this, because it seems to be a sort of politics which I thought we'd left behind. So if you cast your minds back, before Trump and Brexit, the movement of the squares, Occupy, Arab Spring, even before the global financial crisis, a lot of oppositional politics and protest in the West was green. The last major event in this sort of wave seems to have been 2009's Camp for Climate Action in the UK around the G20 summit then. And yet this year, seemingly out of nowhere, two related environmental protests have emerged: Extinction Rebellion and the climate crisis. And the figurehead of the latter, Greta Thunberg, who seems to be endlessly discussed and memed, and with a lot of flame wars between her haters and her lovers. It's a bit of a strange state of affairs because it seemed to have been politics that we had left behind. For me, it recalls very much the protests of the 2000s, though arguably dialed up a notch. So one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam, who actually studied for a PhD in civil disobedience, trying to understand what kinds of actions promoted change, said in a recent interview on the BBC, when it was suggested to him that Extinction Rebellion was a howl of rage, that, and here I quote, "When people go through depression and rage, they come out the other side and decide to do things." So clearly he wants to provoke an emotional reaction. It's obviously an alarmist sort of politics. But the reality of climate change is pretty serious, and the political incoherence of our times and the utter uselessness of political elites means that action is indeed needed. So what we want to do here is take a sober look at the claims and actions of Extinction Rebellion and the strike for climate action, and, as we always strive to do, to place these sorts of politics in their historical context. We're going to record further episodes after this one in the coming weeks on environmental questions, looking at eco-fascism and far-right terrorism, as well as at the burning of the Amazon and conflicts in and over that territory. But what we're going to do today is look at these forms of environmental protests, and we are very delighted to have back Leigh Phillips, who's a science journalist and the author of Austerity, Ecology, and the Collapse of Born Addicts. We discussed that with him back in episode, 14, 15, something like that. It was way back at the beginning. And more recently, he's the author of The People's Republic of Walmart, which we discussed with him and his co-author, Michal Rozwarski, which was the first of our trilogy on the Übermensch of Capital, which I'd highly recommend you check out if you don't know it and haven't heard it yet. All right, let's get started. Leigh, hi, how's it going?
Not bad. How are you doing?
Very well, a little bit bunged up, so sorry to listeners if this sounds a little bit nasal, more nasal than anyone would want.
Bunged up.
Exactly, bunga.
You also have to apologize. You have to apologize for that joke as well.
Yeah, no, that should be written in. That should be like a proviso that we start every episode off with. All right, so let's get started. I think first it might be worth to do a little bit of ground clearing before we talk about Extinction Rebellion's claims, because there's a lot of terms that float around now which don't seem to have been around maybe a decade ago. There's been a lot of, in fact, a lot of kind of terminological fluctuations and adaptations over the course of green politics history, even with just regard to climate change, which we used to discuss as global warming, then it became climate chaos. Today we talk about climate emergency or ecocide or ecological crisis, or now even extinction. So maybe, Leigh, first of all, could you tell us what you think about these different terms, or the terms that we should even be using to discuss these matters?
It's interesting. I think that there's, I understand why people might want to be using more extreme language to provoke a response, or in a sort of popularizing manner. But in terms of the science itself, these are not terms that researchers use. Global warming is sufficient. I think to some extent it might be a case that, as with other areas, there's a sort of linguistic mission creep where the existing term doesn't seem to have had sufficient impact, hasn't moved the dial, hasn't pushed the needle. So maybe if we use a more extreme language, then that will actually change things. So in a similar way to how, everyday racism, which is already bad enough, is now white supremacy. And sort of what used to be described as white supremacy, KKK or neo-Nazis, there's no sort of word for them anymore. Or everything is, already very bad, genuinely terrible. Misogyny is now patriarchy. And so, Saudi Arabia or, certain communities in Israel or in New York, which are genuine patriarchies, we don't have a word to describe for those. And I think, with this, there's been a similar sort of linguistic mission creep, sort of ratcheting up. And so we hear phrases like environmental collapse, ecological collapse, planetary destruction, killing the planet, climate breakdown. And, there was that book by David Wallace Wells, The Uninhabitable Earth. And all of these are not grounded in what the research says. These are add-ons. These are it's already bad enough. We don't need to exaggerate, I would say. I think that's
But
a problem.
They're political terms. Should we derive the contours of appropriate political discourse from the science? That doesn't seem to me to follow.
No, I would agree with that. Scientists describe what is; they don't describe what ought happen, and so it is up to us to, outside of science, to decide what we do in response to the findings. I would agree with that. I think the use, the regular use by these activists to say the science tells us the science doesn't tell us anything about what we have to do or have to not do.
Yeah. I suppose they just the way in which you initially framed it sounded as if the problem was that it was political language that wasn't properly moored in the science, and that there would be a more appropriate language derived from the
no, I mean,
scientific findings.
my problem is, well, one is I do think it exaggerates the scale of the problem, and I think there's political fallout from exaggeration, from alarmism. That's the first problem. The second problem is that the activists are saying the science says that we're in process of ecological collapse. No, what's happening, which is very bad, it is bad enough already, is that we're rapidly moving out of about a 10,000, 12,000 year sort of Goldilocks zone of atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, which has an impact on temperature, average global temperature, which again is the average temperature more or less that we have enjoyed for the last 10,000, 12,000 years. That's actually rare. That set of conditions is actually rare in terms of geological time. But for us humans, that's all that we've ever known. Our entire civilization grew up within this period. So the challenge before us is to try to maintain these optimum conditions, or even to optimize those conditions for humanity. There's no sort of natural set of temperatures for the Earth. The Earth has had much higher temperatures than the worst of what could be predicted in terms of so the upper end of projections of climate change. The planet will be fine. The idea that we're killing the planet, or that life on Earth is about to be eradicated by humans, it's not true at all. What there is a danger is that the set of conditions that allow us to flourish are under threat, and we don't want that. I mean, but that's effectively a deeply anthropocentric perspective, saying that the reason that we are engaged in preventing climate change is because we want to optimize the situation, the set of conditions for humans. The irony is that much of the environmental movement, certainly deep ecologists, want us to leap out of an anthropocentric mindset. And at that point, it makes no sense. At that point, there really literally doesn't matter what ecological changes happen, what climate changes happen, if one takes a biocentric perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would go further with respect to the language, and I think it's not just the kind of inflation and the dangers of alarmism, but also I think it's deeply, I mean, if we actually take seriously what they propose with the specific use of terms, that the idea that it's possible to motivate a progressive politics by suggesting that there's like the idea of climate emergency, and classically, the state of emergency, something associated with extreme and authoritarian visions of politics, where all forms of representation, deliberation, discussion have to be short-circuited, move immediately to executive power in order to enforce decisions that are required by the community, without any attempt to negotiate or mediate competing interests and different social groups, which is exactly in fact what is needed to deal with the problems of the climate, is precisely that we do need to discuss, like you say, the idea of what it means to optimize conditions for humanity, to perpetuate the conditions that we need for human flourishing, what human flourishing looks like. All of those things can't be left to executive fiat to decide. So, the climate emergency, I mean, if we take it, so, I mean, on the one hand, they kind of, the Extinction Rebellion crowd kind of say, oh, no, we don't really mean this. It's only to kind of motivate action. On the other hand, if they want us to take them seriously, it's also deeply sinister implications of the language as well.
Yeah.
So I think, it's more than just creep. I mean, it's also creepy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Two things I would say to that. The first is that one of the reasons that language is problematic is that just sort of a simpler level is that it is very easy for, let's say, climate skeptics or conservatives I don't like to use the term climate denial because I think that there's a sort of resonance there with Holocaust denial, and I don't want to put those on the same level, moral level, that somebody who, however incorrect I may feel that they are with respect to climate change, I don't want to put them in the same basket as neo-Nazis that deny the murder of 6 million Jews. I think it's a deeply morally problematic equivalence there. So nevertheless, there are such people as climate skeptics and conservatives who critique the reality of anthropogenic global warming. And if the advocates for radical climate action are playing fast and loose with what science is saying, it's very easy for those conservatives, for those climate skeptics, to say, well, this is not what the science says. You're making this up. And that allows them to say to other people convincingly that these people don't know what they're talking about. They say that they support science, but they don't. They don't know what there's no relation there. It's very easy to when you exaggerate and when you misrepresent what is said in the Intergovernmental Plan on Climate Change reports or other papers in literature. You can undermine your position. Do you remember when, I think it was last year, there was an early snowfall somewhere in the South, in the U.S. South, and Donald Trump said, "Ha ha! Look at this! It's so much for global warming. The snow's in October, early October," and everybody and their dog, rightly, in terms of climate science and climate activists on Twitter and other social media platforms, said, duh, it's about the trend. It's not, we can't say about any one in particular individual weather event that this now disproves the reality of anthropogenic global warming. But then, of course, they do exactly the same thing, that they immediately will describe any particular forest fire, any particular hurricane as caused by climate change. There's reasons why this isn't even a very good, without even waiting for the assessment of by attribution studies scientists, and they will usually say that there is a what you want to be saying is what role did climate change play in this, in terms of its increasing intensity, or its how does it compare with this likelihood historically, rather than a simple sort of causational relationship there. So it's even just a bad question to be asking, did climate change cause this? But nevertheless, the immediate assumption of that climate caused X, Y, Z extreme weather event is exactly the same process of ignoring overall trends, which is what we care about, not individual events, that Donald Trump did with that light dusting of snow in the U.S. South in October. So that's sort of first very basic problem with the alarmism, that it undermines your reliability, and then undermines the politic that you want to engage in. The second thing is that there is a lot of psychological research that suggests that alarmism on the scale of sort of end of the world catastrophism, people get turned off and say, well, might as well party it up. There's nothing we can do. And they tune out.
Yeah.
And then,
I think,
sorry
to interrupt, but I think because we are going to delve a little bit deeper into that question of alarmism, but I think that might be some really good ground clearing just there to get us started off with.
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead if you want to add something.
No, because I thought Phil's point about the democracy is really, really important. And this is even more serious than the other two points that I just raised there, which is that, James Lovelock, the, hallowed scientist, just turned 100, the inventor of the conception of Gaia, very much beloved figure within the environmental community, and for, in many respects for good reasons. There was an interview that he did in The Guardian a few years ago where he said that democracy does not work with respect to solving the climate crisis and other ecological problems. What we need is some sort of strongman to fix a global strongman to fix the problem. And so this goes precisely to what Phil was saying, that there is the sort of turn away from democracy to because we can't trust the people to vote the right way. That doesn't seem to be working. So we need somebody, an expert, a strongman expert, to come in and clear the decks. Now that's just one person, but then if you look at Extinction Rebellion and their set of demands, now to some extent I can't really, I was an environmental activist for many years. I even was a member of Earth First, so I certainly am not critical of taking direct action when it's necessary. My worry is more with respect to one of the particular demands that they have, which is around citizens' assemblies. That if you go to the Extinction Rebellion...
I'm sorry, Leigh, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we are going to get onto this in a little bit more depth. So I did want to actually just, before we get onto that, just set out a little bit what these specific groups' demands are, because I think it might be worth starting from the kind of concrete politics proposed by these specific movements that have emerged now. Because then I think later on we can go on to contrast them to perhaps earlier waves of environmental movements, as well as to talk about the relationship between these and other forms of politics, other forms of liberal social movements as well. I think it's interesting you point out the alarmism at the beginning and made a connection between that and other forms of rhetorical amplification that you see today around racism and sexism, for example, where, as you say, you call some sort of everyday misogyny, you call that patriarchy, then what do you call Saudi Arabia? So I think it's nice that you made that connection. We do want to return to that towards the end of this. But just to kind of get a little bit more concrete here before we go into the deeper analysis. So Extinction Rebellion, to take that, I don't even know what to call it really. I mean, I suppose it's a movement. We'll use that as a sort of placeholder, though you might, if you want to question that sort of terminology, that categorization, feel free to do so. So Extinction Rebellion makes kind of three claims. 1, tell the truth. 2, act now. 3, beyond politics.
Yeah.
So starting off, let's just go through them one by one. So firstly, tell the truth. What is that as a sort of demand? I mean, obviously everybody wants politicians to tell the truth. That would be good, but it's also sort of a bit of a naive sort of demand to make when, if you live in the world, you realize that politicians often lie. That's how politics works. So, to start off with, what does that sort of say to you?
Well, specifically, when they say tell the truth, they want governments to declare a climate emergency. Now, the irony is that since Extinction Rebellion first popped up, a number of different jurisdictions have now actually declared a climate emergency. Okay, great, but nothing's changed really in terms of policy. So it is, I think you're right, it's a very naive position. Okay, that's a demand that politicians can easily meet. And there's something a bit strange about how their very first demand, tell the truth about what the science is saying about the state of the planet, and then the very first thing that they do is lie about the state of the planet.
I think
saying that 6 billion people are going to die.
I think they're demanding that politicians tell the truth, not saying that they have to tell the truth. So it's consistent in that sense. But with respect to the acting now, what is if truth is the pre-action condition, what's the action they're demanding? So
they want all greenhouse gas emissions to be cut to net zero by 2025. So within 5 years.
And this is how plausible in your judgment?
Not in any way. And once again, for all of their discussion about how we need to respect the science with a capital S, and this is what scientists are saying. If we do, what the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in 2018, a special report on what it would take to keep within 1.5 degrees of warming above historic sort of pre-industrial levels. Which is the sort of more ambitious guardrail adopted within the Paris Agreement in 2015. The hard boundary, the hard guardrail is 2 degrees of warming. And this isn't, again, this report doesn't say what people should do. It was basically politicians within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, climate diplomacy process, asked the researchers through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to come up with a special report to explain, look at different possible pathways. If we decided to go for 1.5 degrees, what would it take? What would some ways of this? What would some ways pathways look like? What would be the impacts of 1.5 degrees of warming? What does the latest science say on that compared to the impacts of 2 degrees? And in terms of cutting emissions, if we wanted to stay within 1.5 degrees, globally, we would have to cut emissions by 45% by 2030 to stay within 1.5 degrees, and to net zero by 2050. So I don't know where they're getting this 2025 from. Nobody's saying this.
Is it is it kind of a more radical demand than is needed to then obviously shift the conversation to a more sort of practical middle ground? I mean that's what it seems.
But it's deeply cynical, because I mean, if that's the justification, so this is what the kind of rough consensus is that Leigh said to 2030, 2050. Let's do something. Let's suggest something which is more extreme in order to rouse people up and to get them going, even though we don't ourselves believe that it's possible. But we cynically need to inflate people's instinct for action.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a deeply cynical, manipulative view of politics, and also paternalistic as well. People are children and need to be pushed and prodded into the right direction because reason is insufficient to appeal to their interests.
To refer to the clip that our listeners will have heard at the beginning there, which was an Extinction Rebellion spokesperson being interviewed on the BBC, that latter bit, they spoke of ambition there. So when they were questioned by Andrew Neil about whether this is plausible, about the claim of becoming of net zero emissions by 2025, they said, well, we put man on the moon without computers, making reference to other great technological leaps, which, okay, kind of gets my juices flowing. But then you realize it's this, this completely unhinged degree of ambition in pursuit of something which can only be austerity. I mean, I think this is what Leigh, you were going to get at as well, that to achieve that aim, you'd need to kind of cut out, as Andrew Neil says, even in that interview, you'd have to stop all people using gas stoves immediately. It's basically
like, imagine if all of humanity's productive power were directed towards austerity. Just imagine all the things that we could do if we had that concerted effort. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, Leigh.
It's fine. I mean, the irony is, of course, that on the natural gas front, that's actually one of the easier things to resolve there. But in terms of, I would be a little bit more generous to them. I think, well, perhaps I'm going to be more generous to the rank and file. Let's say the young people who are enthused and they're just getting involved in politics. I would not put the same level of demand of precision and accuracy to 16 and 17-year-olds that I would to 27, 30, 35, 40-year-olds. And certainly Roger Hallam, who's, I don't know, I think he's in his 50s or 60s. So perhaps there's a little bit more cynicism in the leadership there. But I think, if anything, it's more a sort of naivete in the sense that there's a huge gap between the scale of the radicalization and demands and the policies that would be able to achieve those things. They don't sort of describe what those policies are, or if they do, in the case of things like some of the Green New Deals, which I actually support as a concept, the policies that they sort of lay out, if they do lay out, and Extinction Rebellion is not laying out any particular policies, they tend to be, one, either counterproductive or insufficiently ambitious, in that if we did achieve what they've laid out, to some extent, some of them wouldn't achieve emissions reductions that the rate of emissions reduction that's already happening in a place like Britain, where actually the emissions reduction rate is pretty impressive compared to some other countries. So there's this significant, and part of it comes down to the fact that I think, and this is one of the problems, is that the movement is very much led by NGO activists, non-governmental organization activists, people who've gone through university or college and studied the humanities. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That absolutely has to be part of the conversation. But that are, despite the fact that they're talking about a very, very technical and complicated scientific issue, they aren't, and certainly complicated in terms of engineering and energy systems policies, absolutely. They often aren't very aware of energy systems. They often aren't aware of the policies. I just recently was in a sort of bit of an argument with people who are campaigning for that people should stop flying or reduce flying. And consistently, a number of them said that there's no possible way, there's no technology, no solution on the horizon for clean aviation. And that's just not true. I mean, they simply didn't know that there are possibilities. I mean, some of them for short haul aviation, they're coming on stream literally this season. Like the very first commercial airline in British Columbia, where I live, Harbour Air, they are switching their entire fleet to electric drop-in engines. Now that's not viable for long haul for a range of different reasons, but so they didn't even know, like, some of this is actually already happening. With long haul, it's much more difficult, and but still there's about a dozen different possible options. I mean, there's some that I think are more realistic than other ones, but they literally didn't know that these were on the table. They literally didn't know that it's sort of the cost of these, or what they would. Whenever I mention synthetic hydrocarbons, they immediately thought that I was talking about biofuels. So there's a lot of confusion as well in terms of policies. They really
is that also? Let me ask something. Is that a? No, I just wanted to take the opportunity to ask whether you see that as being of a piece with a certain resistance towards what they see as technical fixes. So
yes, absolutely.
Is there are they ignorant of these things, perhaps just because they're dismissive of it? They want this kind of radical action, but aren't interested in actual concrete, useful solutions. Which I think it's weird also because that radicalism doesn't apply to any kind of social radicalism. I mean, they're not really talking about any different form of social organization either. So it's an ambiguous sort of creature.
Well, I mean, there's a spectrum there. I mean, I don't want to paint them all with the same brush. Some of them are much more familiar with different options than other ones. But it's interesting that the more that people begin to pay attention to any energy systems policy discussions, the more that they begin to move away from some of these more radical positions, and they begin to say, okay, so this is what we need to. The irony, of course, of all of this is that things like a new global fleet of nuclear reactors, whether conventional or moving forward with next generation small modular reactors or something along those lines, because of the upfront capital costs with conventional, we basically do need a significant, and that means that market actors are very unattracted to reactors, even though over the lifetime of these reactors, the energy that we get from them is incredibly cheap, incredibly competitive. So the irony is that there's absolutely a very good argument for why neoliberalism is very ill-suited to solving climate change, that we do need at a very minimum a sort of fairly muscular social democracy, interventionist, industrial policy sort of approach to solve some of these issues. So we do actually need some quite radical reorganization of our politics and economics to solve this. But they're not pushing for that sort of stuff. The irony is that when you put forward what what I've just said, which sounds like quite a radical position to any sort of neoliberal, even if they're centrist U.S. Democrat or a Blairite. Everything has to be left up to the market. The response from a lot of these activists is that, this is just a techno fix, and you're basically saying nothing needs to change in order to solve the problem. I'm a socialist. I genuinely would like to see an end to capitalism in its entirety in the long term. But the reality is that we don't need revolutionary socialism in order to solve the problem. We do need some fairly heavy lifting in terms of a shift away from neoliberal business as usual. But I find it interesting there.
State capitalism would do,
Yes, it would actually, yeah. In fact, a good example of the best example of that would be France in the 1970s and 1980s. Through their nuclearization of their electricity grid, they didn't achieve it 100%, but it's about 80% nuclearized. That was the fastest rate of decline in carbon intensity of any energy system happening ever in the world. And the reason that they were able to achieve that, as all analysts of the French nuclearization program say, is that basically this was the sort of last gasp of post-war étatisme. It was a grand projet d'État that was viable before the sort of the neoliberal revolution, and where there was a very centralized bringing together of expertise, and the state just saying it's going to be this design and this design, and we're just going to build these out over this period, and it doesn't matter what it's going to cost. We're just going to do this. That came to an end by the late 1980s with European energy system liberalization. One of the reasons that France wasn't able to go 100% was that they were blocked basically by European energy liberalization. So anyway, sorry, I'm babbling here a little bit, but basically
but that's a really good illustration. That's a really good illustration. But I did want to actually get back to the actual protest movements themselves before we explore the maybe what to do about climate change a little bit further towards the end. Maybe a way of doing this, because we looked at the kind of Extinction Rebellion's 3 claims of tell the truth, act now, and beyond politics.
We haven't looked at the
but we need to do.
I think that's probably the most important one.
I agree. We're going to do that in just a little bit, because I think it might be worth, just in terms of getting us back to what these protest movements are actually like, contrasting Extinction Rebellion with Climate Strike and its parent organizations like 350.org, just so we have that kind of in our pockets already. Do you see Climate Strike as potentially a bit more moderate than Extinction Rebellion? How would you distinguish the two?
I mean, it's more moderate in its form of activism, in that there's no direct action taking place at the moment. It allows everybody to participate in it fairly straightforward. I mean, I did. I went to 2 global climate strike actions in my hometown. The first one was fairly small, maybe 500 people. The second was like maybe 5,000, and for a small size city like Victoria, where I live, that was not insignificant. It was probably the biggest protest I've seen in the city in a number of years. And around the world, there were something like 4,500 demonstrations globally in 150 different countries. And the very first of the strikes in September, there were some 4 million people estimated participating internationally, and another 2 million a week later. So this is not insignificant. It's 800,000 people, I think, in Montreal. And Montreal is not a very large. I mean, it's a medium-sized city, so it's still a city, but it's not insignificant what's happening here. I think where XR, or Extinction Rebellion, is, there have been some actions internationally, even in Vancouver in the last week, but they're much smaller number of people participating compared to the global climate strike, because you're engaging in direct action, and the very purpose of it is to get arrested. So if you are from sort of an immigrant community, or you're you've got a lot of work, you've got families to take care of, you can't, going to jail is not sort of viable. It's much more exclusive sort of.
It's a yoga retreat, as they like to say. If listeners haven't seen this, I think Extinction Rebellion put out a leaflet advising how their members or their participants what to do if you get arrested and you go to jail. And it starts off with like, bring a good book. We suggest such and such books. Make sure you exercise, do some breathing exercises, and so on.
There's a way that we can be sort of sneering as well. At the same time, my problem with some of the things with Extinction Rebellion are around this tell the truth stuff, where they're not telling the truth. The act now, the demand for 2025 is just it's not realistic, and actually be dangerous at all, and some problems with their beyond politics, which we'll talk about in a second. But in terms of direct action or going to jail, not everybody can participate in that, but there's a grand tradition on the left
for sure,
of people going to jail for justice. I have myself. There's absolutely no way that I would ever critique anybody for engaging in direct action that's peaceful. I do have some issues around some suggestions that they might have wanted to engage in drone, blocking Heathrow with drones, and we still don't know who was responsible for the drone attack on, I think it was Gatwick. Last Christmas.
It might still have been the police. Who
knows?
Drone, right?
We don't know. But if that is them, I would be very strongly opposed to that. I think that's incredibly dangerous and threatening to human life. But at the moment, from what they're doing, it's just direct action. I don't really have a problem with that.
I don't think I wasn't trying to drive at the idea that direct action is problematic, or any of the specific tactics in and of themselves are problematic, but that goes for all tactics. They can't be really analyzed outside of looking at what the overall strategy is.
Exactly.
And this is where you get into a little bit more problematic things that, or rather, things like treating prison as a yoga retreat is a little bit oblivious to certain social realities.
My God, yeah.
So, and that's what was particularly offensive about it.
Oh, I did, yeah, absolutely.
So maybe we should move on to the post-politics, the beyond politics of both Extinction Rebellion and Climate Strike, because they try to position themselves as presenting the only possible solution and something that needs to be immediately adopted without too much discussion, without too much dissension. And I think the way that they're organized as well doesn't particularly encourage internal dissension within the organizations, nor really debate between those organizations and others in terms of how to actually pursue concrete action on climate change.
Yeah, and I think we get a hint of that from the specificity of what's included in this beyond politics demand, the third of Extinction Rebellion's demand, which is that basically they are frustrated with democracy. Democracy does Parliament is beyond hope. What we need is instead a citizens' assembly, where to take decisions instead. And or that they would craft, that the citizens' assembly would craft what is to be done, and then Parliament would just follow what the citizens' assembly has decided. Now, part of this is, to some extent, this is kind of interesting in that what they're drawing on here is the idea of sortition, or where you like a jury for a trial. Where you assume that every human, an adult human, is capable of governing ourselves as any so-called experts or leaders. And I, as a Democrat and a civil libertarian, and as somebody who's critical of the state, that's just very attractive. But the devil is really in the details here, in that this form of sortition now pushes a lot of gives over a lot of power to the people who organize that citizens' assembly. If you go to the website, the Extinction Rebellion website, you see how this would be set up, and they look to things like the citizens' assembly in Ireland with respect to abortion and same-sex marriage. And there's some interesting things there, but the language that they use on the website is that the citizens' assembly, people will be drawn from across the country randomly, and then they, quote, will hear balanced information from experts and those most affected by the emergency with the aid of professional facilitators run by non-governmental organizations under independent oversight, to cut through party politics. So basically what they're saying there is that we will decide what information this citizens' assembly is able to consider. So instead of a series of people, in the case of Ireland, or for example in South Korea, the citizens' assembly there that was tasked with assessing whether they would move ahead with continuing to build a series of nuclear plants, where the civil servants servicing the citizens' assembly pulled from all sorts of different information venues and then left people to decide themselves. This would be a very, very corralled bit of information decided by the NGOs and these professional facilitators, so that they will tell people what to do. So this is going back to Phil's argument previously, and also where he was critical of this, or James Lovelock's, where this is exactly what James Lovelock is arguing for, which is that we do an end run around democracy and that there's a series of experts that know what to do. Oh, and those experts happen to be us.
Yeah, it's worse than that though, because I think with abortion and gay marriage, I mean those are things which are particularly with abortion. I mean it's something which affects potentially everyone to the degree everybody's partner or somebody they know might need to have an abortion, at least 50% of the population. Whereas with something like climate change, there are distinctive constituencies and groups whose will be affected differently, or who have different resources or different needs, or belong to different industries, and all sorts, in all sorts of ways that is much more complex than the much more basic issue, such as should we have abortion or not. And yes, mediating all of those interests, I think, is something which precisely requires representative politics and can't be resolved by a citizens' assembly.
Yeah, I mean that's always the problem with sortition, is that it's the last kind of resort of political movements which are anti-majoritarian, yes, because they look to short circuit any representative processes, and that's why it's always one of the reasons why sortition has come back on the agenda since 2016 in a whole range of formats, citizens juries being only one of them. And it just ends up being a completely managed. It's something that the PMC love, because it's like, it's like a focus group. We can just have focus group democracy, and we can make sure that people have a steered and led towards the correct outcome, because it's a turning away from the majoritarian need to convince a whole group of people, mobilize them, catalyze them behind a full set of policies, which. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to dismiss it, but you should. I feel like we should dismiss it.
But it's interesting though, because I do like proposals for sortition, because they serve as a useful thought experiment, insofar as they expose
why it's bad.
Because they also expose the limitations of contemporary representative democracy, precisely for its lack of representation, precisely for its empowering of establishment or established powers in society, who can kind of short circuit the representative and democratic process. So I think it's useful in that, in the way that Leigh precisely said, which it proposes any one of us could rule, any one individual could rule, and it's chosen completely at random. But we
don't want any one individual to rule. We want to rule collectively.
But you form an assembly by sortition. So it does. But the interesting thing is that the Extinction Rebellion didn't have the courage of their conviction with sortition, because they also, as well as all the other provisos that they put in place, as Leigh has just explained, they also want demographic quotas to make sure that it's fully representative, which is kind of against the idea of sortition.
Yes.
Because it already presupposes that there are certain defined groups in society that need to be represented. The whole point of sortition is that we are entirely a mass of people who are all, as individuals, equal to one another. So you don't have quotas. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting contradiction there, and I think it does expose the lack of courage of their convictions in presenting themselves as being democratic.
It's an interesting conversation around sortition. If we were to, let's say, tomorrow replace the UK Parliament or the Canadian Parliament or the US Congress with sortition for all subjects, I mean, I'd be interested in having a conversation about that. There's some, every cook can govern sort of aspect to that, and I think that juries that do exist in terms of the legal system, the Anglophone legal system, I think are superb, and I think need to be defended. It's at the same time, even if that were to happen, suddenly the people who have significant power shift from being, let's say, the MPs or the lobbyists, those MPs, to the civil service that services that those assembly members in the Citizens' Assembly. So even though it seems at first glance like it's going to be more democratic, you do suddenly shift over to giving enormous power to those people who decide what information the jury, the citizens' jury, receive. Now, maybe that's something that can be resolved. I don't know. That's an interesting conversation. But what we're doing here with the specific version of sortition that's proposed by Extinction Rebellion is it basically accepting that that set of civil servants that service the assembly members, citizens' assembly members, do have enormous power, and they will be us. So it is an assertion of a dictatorship in this case. It's a very explicit authoritarian maneuver under the guise of having a more democratic, under the guise of a more democratic system like sortition. It's actually deeply undemocratic what they're proposing.
Yeah, which I think is in line with their radicalism, which is something I mentioned earlier, which they are not very interested in techno fixes. They want radical, immediate action, which is very severe, pretty much unachievable, or achievable only with the most drastic and quite violent means, really. And yet there's no real questioning of social organization at the same time. So the radicalism it only seems to apply to the realm of state action and not to society itself. Right? So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I mean, I think that which also relates to something which I wanted to touch on, which is their relationship to the radical left, such as it is, that they don't seem to, I mean, at least I get the impression that they see the radical left as sort of too political and too obstructionistic, too interested in social change, questions about social organization, revolution, what have you, and that they are focused merely on climate action, and that's what needs to happen.
It's complicated. We're talking about two amorphous organizational forms, and then in addition, a raft of other organizations and individual activists and conversations. So it's hard to. So it really does depend in terms of the relationship of these organizations or other organizations or activists to the radical left. I think what one can say is that there's this. I mean, Roger Hallam. He talks about. He simultaneously has talked about. The usual cliche that we hear of neither right nor left but forward, kind of like vomitous banality there. On the other hand, I mean, he was interviewed by Owen Jones a few days ago, where he basically said, yeah, okay, I might be saying that, but really, like, come on, I'm a lefty. So there's a sort of dishonesty there, I think. But also, and at the same time, there's a lot of the dying radical left organizations, Trotskyist and so on and so forth, are jumping on board with this stuff, as they do with every new sort of mass movement, and get their fingers stuck in it without any sort of critical analysis. And historically, I think socialists would have made arguments about how climate change is real. There are significant challenges that we face in terms with other environmental issues. But let's look at this from a sort of class perspective. What are the contradictions within capitalism that might be causing this, such as market forces, and there are the incentive structures there to continue to produce a commodity that we know is harmful. No, instead it's the sort of vague sort of critiques of growth, of modernity, of humanity, even that the left socialists certainly would have historically critiqued and said, whoa, those are actually quite reactionary positions. I think the radical left, because they are so weak these days in some in many places, that traditional Trotskyist organizations or what have you, that they are doing what we used to describe as adaptationist activities, where they will adapt their politics to whatever the flavor of the month is and hide their critiques, or even just pretend that they don't have any critiques, or even actually begin to adopt these new positions and trying to suggest that they're still in alignment with their historic Marxist positions. So I think
exactly. But I think this is why I find the emergence of these movements right now in 2019 so perplexing, which is something I referenced in the introduction. That even if you take elements of the socialist left and their kind of approximation to some of these movements is, as you said, they traditionally would be more critical of this sort of stuff. What's mad is that in 2019, thinking surely in the past decade we've learned enough and have advanced enough a sort of materialist understanding of politics, at least have reintroduced a discourse on inequality subsequent to Occupy, to also reintroduce a discussion of class, whether it be Corbyn or even more so Bernie Sanders in the US, that to return back to this form of post politics seems really bizarre, really surprising, and it makes me wonder, is this some sort of retro end of history movement? Have we given up on the openings that have emerged in the past decade, and now we're returning to this sort of form of green politics, which dominated the 2000s?
No, I think. I think there's two things to say to that. The first is that there has been a learning. I don't think this is the same climate movement that existed prior to the global financial crisis. The conversations around a just transition now, particularly within the United States and Canada, there is an importation of an understanding of class and inequality to some extent there, although it's more often discussed in the abstract than the concrete, and you find that for example, where there's not a lot of conversations by advocates of the Green New Deal, which is supposed to be about a just transition, making sure that fossil fuel workers who are affected by the transition will be taken care of appropriately and make sure that there's good jobs for them in the new clean economy. Ironically, they're often not actually speaking to the trade unions and workers in those in those specific fields. In those areas, so for example, in Maine, now a lot of Green New Deal activists did actually go and speak to a number of trade unions ahead of drafting their Green New Deal proposal specific to that state. And what's interesting there is that there's much more amenability. The trade unions are much more amenable to the conception of a Green New Deal than in other regions. And also, the Green New Deal set of proposals themselves include a number of arguments or demands that the unions themselves came up with, particularly around things like apprenticeships, which in Maine they feel are very, very important in terms of making sure that they're able to make that transition. So that's so I would say that it's not a simple argument that it's just a repetition of the professional managerial class or middle class green politics prior to the global financial crisis. Something has changed. When we're talking about just transition, people do have an awareness of that. But it hasn't gone far enough. And I think part of that does come to the fact that it is still overwhelmingly more of a sort of a middle class phenomenon. at the same time, I think we also have to talk about how economic frustrations can express themselves in non-clearly class ways or non-clearly economic ways. I think, your recent interview about the Hong Kong protests and how even though the demands of the protesters are explicitly political and try to avoid any conversation about the housing crisis in Hong Kong, or the fact that people have gone to university and college are sort of downwardly mobile, because if they begin to use that economic language, that's the language of the Communist Party, and so they're explicitly trying to avoid that because that's their enemy. Nevertheless, one can't talk about the Hong Kong protests outside of there being this post-global financial crisis, housing crisis, and increasing inequality and lack of career opportunities. And I think it's the same thing here, is that even though there's certainly more of a middle class sort of flavor to some of these protests, I think these are many of the same people who participated or of the same sort of flavor as the people who either did protest and Occupy or similar sort of movements. And that there is a sort of dislocation of their frustration that, if we can go back to the late philosopher Mark Fisher's position or argumentation around what he called capitalist realism, in suggesting that it's just so obvious that we can't defeat capitalism, that there is no other way other than capitalism. And it's just so this not merely conscious acceptance that there's no other way, but an unconscious acceptance as well. So in this case, even as some of them are explicitly using language that is anti-capitalist, they themselves basically have abandoned all faith that the working class can be an agent of change, that there can actually be any radical transformations of society in a socialist manner, and that instead there is this deus ex machina of nature that will wipe the slate clean. That there's a sort of celebration of, even though they say that they're fighting against this, there's a sort of, this is the great flood that will clean us all and will make everything, that will restart society again.
So as capital comes to seamlessly occupy the horizons of the imaginable, yes, it's nature that comes and saves us, not the collective agency of the working class. Yeah, no, I think that's hits the nail on the head, actually.
But it also speaks to a certain exhaustion,
yes,
as well, which I think that's probably the most dispiriting thing about the emergence of these. And again, social movements arguing for action and pushing for action on climate change are very important and are to be welcomed, but not in this form. And precisely by adopting this sort of post-political kind of form, they and the alarmism and all the other stuff that we've discussed, they act, in fact, probably more than anything as an actual roadblock to actual sort of change. So I think that's maybe what's most dispiriting about this.
Yeah, and to the extent that they do articulate, and I say they, this big amorphous they, but let's say Greta Thunberg, in her speech to the UN,
fuck's sake, Leigh, we made it about an hour, and now you had to do it. You had to mention Greta.
So sorry, who's this we're talking about? I'm not sure. I've heard about this person.
Yeah, so I mean, I neither hate her nor love her, and I have equal contempt for those, figures who dismiss her and seem to have this real, hatred, like profound hatred for her, and then on the other hand, the politicians who sort of bow before her and think she's the second coming of the mother of Jesus. I think two things to say about her with respect to this is that, one, good on her. She's 16 years old. She's just getting involved in politics. She's well done for participating in the grand public democratic conversation. And I would say that about anybody at that age who's beginning to do this. So well done, Greta. Absolutely. But she's a teenager. I mean, she calls herself a child, but she's a teenager, and she has endorsed a series of policy positions. And I think those, while celebrating her as a young person who's getting involved in politics is fine. There's nothing wrong with us taking on her ideas and critiquing them, saying, would that work? Would that not work? Are there problems with this? Are there not problems with it in terms of achieving what you want to achieve? And specifically, I would say things like her speech to the UN, where she endorses basically degrowth. It was a deeply reactionary Malthusian position. Her opposition to nuclear power. That is one of the biggest barriers that we have to rapidly dealing with the climate crisis. The popular green NGO-led opposition to nuclear power, which is irrational and is not based in science or understanding of energy systems, needs to be overcome. It is a real barrier to solving the problem. And then finally, her stunt, her anti-aviation stunt, taking a Royal Monegasque yacht across the Atlantic for an anti-aviation perspective, instead of arguing for a policy of an industrial policy that would take synthetic hydrocarbons from the current proof of concept or minor commercialization sort of stages through to full commercialization, while working with workers in the airline and aviation industry, the air stewards and pilots and air traffic controllers, to ensure a just and clean transition. So all three of those things, degrowth, anti-nuclear, anti-aviation, they're fundamental strategic barriers to dealing with the climate crisis. And I think there's nothing wrong with us saying critiquing those positions of Greta.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's very well put. And I maybe just as a way of wrapping this up, put a final bow on the point about nuclear, which, if there is one single silver bullet for this whole discussion, that seems to be the most plausible, reasonable, and pragmatic one. And it's a line that you've been pushing quite a lot, Leigh, and have definitely won me over even more to that position than I was before.
Absolutely. It's not just because it's a firm, reliable, and clean source of electricity, but it provides a whole range of other options covering that will potentially help significantly with those hard to electrify parts of our economy that also need to be decarbonized. So things like aviation, long-haul trucking, long-haul shipping, the role of nuclear in producing cheap, clean, synthetic hydrocarbons using process heat. Renewables can't do that. They don't have a process heat sort of commodity that they can sell. Variable renewables in general can't help much with the production of clean steel because of the high temperatures. And actually, even many nuclear reactor designs can't, but some can. High temperature gas reactors could provide the more than 900 degrees centigrade temperatures needed for steel production. And if we're going to be building out all of these new to solve the housing crisis and have a new housing that is optimized for climate, that has is much more energy efficient and so on and so forth, we're going to need a lot of steel to produce all that housing. So that steel definitely needs to be cleaned up. Resource extraction in remote areas. It's very difficult to build out transmission lines to those places. So those are usually serviced by diesel generators. Well, instead we could have small modular reactors that are competitive with or much cheaper than those diesel generators. In which case we're suddenly cleaning up industrial extraction processes. So, I mean, nuclear is this sort of Swiss Army knife that can solve many, many different problems. It's not the whole solution. I think wind is a really great solution in some areas. I think in Britain, wind is playing a fantastic role, partially because it's able to be backed up by firm sources of clean energy like nuclear in the UK. In other places, lower latitudes, solar can play a significant role as well. But it's about right-sizing all of the different options, all of the above, please. And but the climate movement, unfortunately, is not looking at these. And I think, having said all that, I do think that more and more people are taking a more of let's say, an eco-modernist approach, and I have my critiques of eco-modernism as well with respect to its sort of economic understanding, but that takes climate change very seriously, takes biodiversity loss very seriously, takes nitrogen pollution very seriously, and all the sort of allied biocrises very seriously, and say they are real and we do need to solve these problems. And these are the series of technologies that we'll need to solve them. And is actually very realistic about the scale of the problem, not using alarmism or catastrophism. More and more people, particularly young people, are embracing that sort of approach. I'm thinking of things like Generation Atomic, which is this new youth-led green NGO out of the United States and to some extent within Canada. Bright New Green, I think they're called, out of Australia, which is leading the charge in pushing for adoption of nuclear and other similar sort of technological options in Australia. And they have been absolutely essential in pushing public opinion from being strong majority opposed to use of nuclear in Australia to now a strong majority in favor of nuclear power. So there's some good stuff out there as well. And I would direct listeners to looking out for those sorts of folks and inform themselves about the options where we get to keep all of the great stuff of modernity and just make it clean.
Excellent stuff. Love it. And I'm glad that you were able to give those shouts out at the end, lest anyone accuse us of being merely critics and cynics on this question, but that we're actually interested in talking about concrete solutions for this. And also that we recognize that politics isn't going to come back by raising the alarms about extinction, full collapse, and existential threats, but instead will only be brought back through actual class struggle. So we can't hope that climate change politics does the work for us.
No, and if there's another economic crisis, I bet you suddenly, just as happened after 2008, that suddenly everybody gets focused on anti-austerity politics again.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, maybe to recap and bring us back to where we started, it's actually amazing and disappointing that we're back at kind of 2007 style politics, a decade on from, or more than a decade on from the global financial crisis. But I think hopefully, at least with making these criticisms, we can clear a bit of ground and be clear that these sorts of alarmist politics and indeed post politics aren't the solution.
No, sorry, one last tiny thing, I would add an asterisk to this alarmism conversation in that while if we're talking up to the end of the century, then the conversation by people like Roger Hallam and so on and so forth is, it's completely unsupported. It's not the case that 6 billion people will die. It is, the worst case scenarios would be that agricultural yields would be reduced by 10 to 20% compared to business as usual in the absence of any new technological change. And, that's significant, but it's not the end of the world. And even in some temperate regions, there will probably be an increase in, for example, wheat yields. But if we look further down the line to 2300, 2500, and we still haven't solved the problem by then yeah, we are really, that is getting very, very worrying. But the irony is that they don't usually talk about that sort of stuff. And the reason it's quite disconcerting is that we are putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a much faster rate than during, out of the 5 major extinction events. Most of them are related to significant changes in atmospheric chemistry composition. including usually greenhouse gas concentrations. If we don't resolve this problem by the end of this century, then there really is some very, very serious problems potentially on the horizon. So the irony is that they're both too alarmist with respect to this century and not alarmist enough with respect to the much more sort of geological scale of the problem.
Excellent. Nicely put. Thank you, Leigh. Always great to have you on. And in fact, listeners, Leigh will be on again soon because we're going to be talking about eco-fascism with Leigh a little ways down the line in another episode. Cheers, Leigh.
No problem.